Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the first day of the conference. My name is Kathryn Edwards, and I'm a labor economist at the RAND Corporation and a longtime Academy member. And I'm joined here by three panelists who are going to introduce themselves. First, Daisy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daisy Gonzalez. I'm the lead member organizer at the Garment Worker Center in Los Angeles.
Welcome, Daisy. Sandy.
I'm William Darity, known better as Sandy, and I am the director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University.
Thank you. And Jessica.
I'm Jess Bartholow, and I'm the Chief of Staff for Senator Nancy Skinner, the chairperson of the Joint Legislative Budget Committee and the Committee on Budget and Fiscal in California, and formerly at the Western Center on Law and Poverty, an anti-poverty advocate for 20 years.
Thank you three so much for joining us. The reason for the conference and what we'd like to talk about today is economic insecurity and security in the U.S. A recent Academy report outlines that when it comes to economic security, there's no single policy that can solve problems that Americans are facing, that it has to be a policy strategy. We identify four pillars of that strategy: benefit policy, labor policy, protection policy, and equity policy. Benefit policy is probably the one that a lot of us are more familiar with as experts and researchers, which is the taxing and spending of the federal government. Labor policy is meant to ensure access to decent work and fair compensation for workers. Protection policy is meant to bolster economic security by promoting savings and mitigating malicious threats to income. And finally, equity policy is meant to lessen the large disparities in well-being that exist across demographic groups in the U.S. So I want to start and take it back to the panel of, what are sources of economic insecurity for either the groups that you research or represent or the people that you work with? What does labor policy or equity policy or protection policy mean to them? We'll start with Daisy.
Yeah, I can start. Thank you. So I work with garment workers. It's an industry of 45,000, estimated 45,000 in Los Angeles. And garment workers are working essentially in sweatshops in modern day California, right? And the experiences that they're facing is that they are actually not making even minimum wage for essential work that they're doing right now during the pandemic. Many of these factories have, historically produced apparel, T-shirts, dresses. Some of these are denim production. And some of them are dye houses. But during the pandemic, a lot of this production actually switched over to masks and hospital robes, even some places producing face shields. And these workers are not making minimum wage. They're paid by the piece. So what that means is that every seam that's sewn on an article of clothing it's priced depending on the operation. These are skilled workers that operate industrial machinery and have decades of experience, but the piece rate can be as low as 2 to 3 cents. So it doesn't matter how quickly they're operating or producing. Some of their wages can be between $150 for a 60-hour work week to $350 for a 60-hour work week, which boils down to $5 or $6 per hour.
And Daisy, I'll probably say some part of this wrong, but there's an exception to the Fair Labor Standards Act for piece rate workers. That is why they're not paid by the wage, but by piece rate. Is that right?
What I understand is actually that in California legislation that was passed in 1999, there is the ability to pay a piece rate as long as that piece rate meets minimum wage standards. And that is where the disconnect is. Piece rate is actually what is used to rob these workers of their wages, and employers are not guaranteeing that minimum wage. And so we're working on policy here in California to ensure that that piece rate is actually eliminated to guarantee that minimum wage.
Thank you for that. So Jess, I'm going to go to you next. One thing that we struggle with is the idea of protection policy, that even if you are able to get an income, that doesn't mean that it's not vulnerable to malicious threat and other kind of forms of capture. I know that the senator has worked on this, and you have as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to think about all the people involved with the academy and all the people throughout the decades that have worked so hard to create a system of social insurance, I bet it would be really upsetting to them to find that the income we think we're providing to people to provide for their very basic needs is taken. It's absolutely taken. And sometimes, most of the times, it's taken by us, by the same government that has provided for that income. So for example, we have a gentleman who's in his 70s. He's disabled. He can no longer work. He lives in San Francisco, and he pays almost all of his Social Security to pay for back child support debt that's owed to the government. And it goes straight back to the federal government and the state government and local government for the purposes of collecting those dollars. We're going to talk a little later about the many different ways in which criminal justice fines and fees and aggressive social policies, medical debt, school debt, college debt, school meal debt. We have families being sued because their child got a meal at school, undermines and erodes all that we've put in place in social insurance. And that's what I look forward to talking to you about today.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then Sandy, to you, I suppose it's kind of a large question to say, what do Black people need in the US today in order to have a policy oriented to equity? But we'll start with a large question.
Well, let me start by saying that I think virtually all workers in the United States are confronted with the potential loss of income that's associated with the threat of job loss. And I think that that's something that we need to address in our conversation today. But then a significant segment of the workforce, which is disproportionately Black, is also confronted with low pay and also confronted with a situation in which their access to benefits are quite restricted. In many instances, they do not receive benefits of any form. And that's especially significant in the midst of a pandemic where people's health insurance needs become very, very transparent. But in terms of kind of the differential disadvantage that's confronted by Black Americans, I would argue that we need to look not only at income support issues, but also at the issue of wealth differentials between Black and white Americans. So with respect to the income differentials, that is significantly driven by the fact that the Black unemployment rate is consistently 2 times as high as the white rate. This holds for all levels of education. And in fact, Blacks with some college education frequently have a higher unemployment rate than whites who never finished high school. So the unemployment differential is a very powerful index of the degree of discrimination in the economy. But with respect to wealth differences, as opposed to income differences, the differences by race between the value of what you own and what you owe, or your net worth, we're talking about something along the order of $840,000 per household in the United States on average. And this differential is a differential not only in terms of protection, but also in terms of opportunity in the society. And that's something that must be bridged by transformative national policy.
Thank you for that. It's striking to me just, hearing the three of you talk about this, just how large these problems seem, but I know that you have all worked on them, for a considerable time, that where have you found success in kind of working with policy, either, with an employer, with the state, with the federal government, where have you seen wins in your work? And Daisy, we can start with you.
I wanted to add a little bit more about the population of garment workers as well. So the majority of workers are Latino. They are from Mexico, and over the years, we've seen more workers from Central America. And to answer your question, we've had some success with statewide legislation, right? I mentioned in 1999, the first it was a historic piece of legislation, because it allowed garment workers to use the state's resources to recover stolen wages, and this actually came from a case of modern day slavery that was found in South El Monte, where workers had been trafficked from Thailand to they were imprisoned in a factory and not being paid. They were held prisoner, and after a couple of these people were able to escape that situation, it brought attention to the modern day slavery, the sweatshop that's happening, the sweatshops that are operating here in California, and that allowed for some up the chain liability in the industry, but it didn't go as far as we needed to, and that's where we're continuing to push today. We really need to, of course, this is an issue that we see in multiple places, across the world, right? It is an international issue, but here in California, what we see is that brands are not actually held liable for the wages that we see in the industry. They pay very little for production, and so many of these factories are they're not able to meet minimum wage standards, right? Especially in California, we're looking at a minimum wage of almost $15 an hour in some places. Another issue that I wanted to raise is that we, have seen some success with the Department of Labor. They, their wage standards unit has had very successful investigations in the industry, but when workers use the DOL to recover wages, they're recovering wages at the federal minimum wage, right? Which is way less than California's, and not enough really for the living wage that's necessary in this state.
Jess, what about you? Successes and things that you've learned from them?
Yeah, I mean, the best successes we've had here in California and nationally have been led by impacted people. So I just want to start there. If you want to make sure and have a holistic reform and one that sticks and one that really reflects what people need, it's got to involve those people who are most impacted by the harms. So a couple I'd like to highlight is the repeal of juvenile justice fees. People, who are listening to this panel might not know that when a child is arrested and detained, when they're adjudicated as a minor, their families are charged with attorney's fees, detention fees, probation fees. In California, we had longstanding statute, had been there a couple decades, that charged the families approximately $30 a day for their time there, for their food, even when the food was provided for free by the United States Department of Agriculture, free meal program. They were charged for their clothing, for their bedding, and these fees would add up. And the greatest harm was that the youth that were being arrested and detained were predominantly low-income youth of color, right? These communities are over-surveilled, they're over-arrested, over-cited, over-convicted or adjudicated, and then their length of time in juvenile hall is longer than their white counterparts, and so, or middle class or wealthy counterparts who might not get any time at all. And so they'd end up with these thousands and thousands of dollars of debt, and it would create these real conflicts when they'd come home, and it created a cycle of, of the youth feeling bad about themselves, of the youth kind of giving up on their families, on their communities, their families sometimes giving up on them, and you'd have a cycle of children in and out of juvie hall, and then they become adults in and out of jail and prison. These fees were recidivistic, they were harmful, they caused hunger, they caused homelessness. And in California this year on January 1, we ended the collection of all fees. We had in 2018 ended the establishment of new fees, but that movement really did start with youth in LA that got a moratorium. These young people who got a moratorium in Los Angeles in 2010. This movement is now across the country, and we have 15 states that are working on this. Congressman Cardenas from Los Angeles has a piece of legislation that would give money towards mental health and support services to youth who are in the criminal justice system rather than the youth justice system, rather than harming them, to those states that have decided to stop these fees. So that's one example I think we're really proud of. In California, as well as many other states, you see Florida, you see action in New York. We are, I think, Illinois. We're turning towards adult fees. In California, last year, then Senator Holly Mitchell, she's now Board of Supervisor Holly Mitchell, she introduced a piece of legislation. It was about this tall, the bill. The bill was this tall. We weighed it. It was 13 pounds. And all the bill did, the only thing the bill did was repeal all the adult fees and in the criminal justice system. And people would say, well, that's a big bill. And we would say, yeah, it's pretty big, right? It weighs a lot too. And that's how much people of color, low-income people of color in our state are carrying on their backs. If you think that's big, you should try to live with these really big, outsized, impactful fees in your life, in your community. How much money is that taking out? So we repealed 23 of the fees in last year's budget. And that was $16 billion worth of fees that were being, that were owed. Now, the collection rate on that was 8%. So the government wasn't getting very much, but it was harming them with, credit scores and wage garnishments and bank levies worth $16 billion in the poorest neighborhoods in our state. My boss is continuing to work with her counterpart, Senator Bradford. They're moving forward to try to get the rest of the fees, or 61 more fees. Debt-free justice is the name of the workers who are led by impacted people, leading this work across the state and in the country. So I want to highlight that. And then also, one of the other things we've been doing is to try to minimize the harm of debt collection from private debt. And how do we do that? Well, in California, we had this debt collector take all kind of policy for our bank levies. So if you owed a consumer debt, whether it be healthcare debt or student loan debt, consumer student loan debt, whatever that consumer loan or the consumer debt was, they could come in and levy your bank down to zero. And then of course your bank would charge a fee, because there's a fee for a levy. So you would go to negative, then you'd have bounce checks, and when you go super negative, and it would end up in a case where you just were better off closing your bank account. So we were creating these policies that would then drive people into the underground banking system. They'd give up their bank accounts, they'd be in debt, with all of these dollars just because they couldn't save a little bit of money in their banking account. So last year in September, we implemented a new policy that protects the first $1,800 or so of a bank account. So you can levy down to $1,800, but then the people get to keep a little bit. They don't have to go into debt into their bank account. They don't have to close their bank account. And that bill was 616, the Senate bill 616 by Senator Wojciechowski. We understand other states are looking at that and similar bank levy protection policies. And then wage garnishment. Wage garnishment, about 4 years ago, we passed a law, also by Senator Wojciechowski, SB, I can't remember the name of it. But this bill protects wage garnishment for anybody earning below minimum wage at 40 hours a week. Why should we be taking money from people who are so poor that they can qualify for public benefit, right? And so if you're earning less than 40 hours a week worth of minimum wage, you can't be garnished. Your wages can't be garnished. But and then after that, it's a sliding scale. So it's not a cliff. You don't get to that mark and then all of a sudden you're garnished 65% of your wages. We're still working on that for government debt, because if you owe the government, and if the Franchise Tax Board in California gets that government debt in their hands, then they will garnish your wages at 65%, which is just, it pushes people out of the job market altogether. And so we're working on that. We can go on and on. You can't believe the list of things that are out there to take away the money from poor people, especially poor communities of color. And we've got to pick them off one by one and sit at the table with impacted people. And that's what we're doing. And I'm really proud of people across the country working on these things.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing about that. And congratulations on those victories. And a small amount of debt can mean a lot to people. So Sandy, to you, the same question, have you seen progress or any wins in kind of the idea of equity being incorporated into policy? Anything that we can learn from, or are we kind of starting from ground zero?
I think that something that points in the direction of greater equity is the shift away from an emphasis on a universal basic income, where everyone who receives an income supplement gets the same amount regardless of their own economic position, toward what we might call a guaranteed income, where everyone is assured of some minimum level of income, and the individuals who receive the supplements are those who have the lowest levels of income. And there is momentum in a number of cities attempting to establish experiments in this direction. I think that that's a positive sign. I wish that there would be a greater emphasis on trying to establish guarantee of employment as opposed to simply guarantee of income. And in fact, Jess is importuning that we should pay attention to the views of the people most affected. It's interesting to note that in the United States today, 90% of Americans are in favor of the federal government guaranteeing employment for all of the nation's citizens. And an employment guarantee would involve the provision of an assurance of employment for every American from the public sector through the federal government, with an assurance of non-poverty wages, as well as a benefits package that would be similar to the benefits that are provided to all federal civil servants. So this would be inclusive of health insurance. And if we were to do that, we would change the floor for compensation in all employment across the country, because the private sector would have to at least match the compensation that's offered through these public sector jobs to get anybody to work for them at all. And this would have a tremendous effect on sweatshop wage work. This would have a tremendous effect on restaurant workers, because people could exit from those jobs unless the compensation was satisfactory. And I think that if we could push towards an environment in which we had both a job guarantee and a guarantee of income for all Americans. But I think that I prefer a world with a guarantee of employment if we don't have a guarantee of income, to a world where we have a guarantee of income without a guarantee of employment. And the reason is the following. First, the job guarantee puts pressure on the private sector to meet the employment conditions and standards that are associated with the public sector jobs. And second, the presence of a job guarantee would allow us to perform a set of socially useful work, a body of socially useful work that is not going to be provided in terms of adequate quality, quantity, or access by the private sector. And one illustration is the possibility of developing a professional workforce for care work, especially child and elder care, that we do not have in the present moment. And such a workforce could provide those services to all Americans at very low cost. This would be very transformative for our society.
Something that I think your point got to is the idea of mobility, and that economic security is not just about a one-time state or reaching a certain level of income or position. It's a feeling of security that kind of looks forward in both that something bad won't necessarily derail you, and also that you can continue moving upwards. Daisy, I'm wondering if you can talk about the idea of economic security and mobility amongst garment workers. How long do they have these jobs? Is it easy to find a new type of employment, or is it associated with a real lack of mobility?
Yeah, I'm really happy you're asking that question, because I was just thinking that I really wanted to lift up how passionate garment workers are about the work that they do. We hear from we're a member organization, and so all of the work that we do is actually led by garment workers, and every position our organization takes or legislation that we take on is the decisions are made by the actual workers. And um, workers are leading this legislative fight that we have right now, SB 62, which is the Garment Worker Protection Act. And we hear from them every day that this is work that they love, that they're passionate about. They've been in the industry for many people for up to 30 years. And they want to really transform this industry to allow them to make wages and an income to be able to live off of. Right now, workers, because of these low wages, are in shared housing, families renting one room within an apartment, and sharing housing with other garment workers just to be able to survive. And workers aspire to be able to open up their own factories. We're starting conversations around worker cooperatives as well. And even during the pandemic, we were able to create a program to allow workers to produce masks at home at wages that actually are living wages. So yeah, for workers, there's a passion to transform this industry and stay in this industry.
What's in the legislation in the Protection Act that they are asking for?
The elimination of the piece rate is number one, and for brand accountability, brand liability, for the wages, they when they are in their workplace and standing up for their rights and asking for higher wages or to meet minimum wage standards, they hear from their employers that the brands, the manufacturers aren't paying enough for the production to be able to meet those wages. We even have some garment workers who have owned their own businesses in the past and have experienced that. So for them, those are the two key pieces of that legislation.
So Jess, you had talked earlier about kind of these forgiving these or stopping collection on certain debt practices. Daisy's talked about the minimum wage. Sandy has talked about a federal jobs guarantee and the type of cascading effects these policies could have. But what are some other policies maybe that we haven't talked about yet that you think would be, important for protection, important for economic security? And Jess, we can start with you.
I just need to acknowledge, I feel on the screen here, I'm like sandwiched between Dr. Darity and Daisy. And and I just really feel the things they're saying on a really deep level personally, right? As Daisy knows, my mom was a piece rate worker. She ironed shirts for $1 a piece. And, to some people, it doesn't sound like a dignified job. She loved it. She really loved it. She loved her customers. She felt really a lot of pride in her ability to iron shirts like nobody's business and make people look good. We had the dingiest clothes. Growing up, we got it all secondhand and in bags at the laundry mat where people gave up their clothes. But we looked great because she ironed our clothes, and we looked always just amazing. She danced and sung and had a great time while she was ironing. There's a lot of dignity in work, and as Dr. Darity said, we should be looking at work. Why do people support a work guarantee? Because they want that meaning. They want that contribution and participation in their community. And just getting money is, even though it meets your basic needs, is not the same as having a job and contributing in the ways that people are saying they want to. My mom made that job for herself because she couldn't find one. She looked. She was a bookkeeper. She wrote a hot check. She was arrested. And she wasn't able to do that anymore. we were poor, and she did what she needed to do, put food on the table, and was detained in jail without bail because we didn't have it. And she was kind of missing for a couple of days until, and we didn't have a phone at the house, so she couldn't call. And so she finally came home, and she had to find her other way to find work and keep us all together and not homeless. And so that's what she turned to piece rate work. So I just say this because it's, it's all a continuum of ourselves and our families and how we move up. I do want to highlight, like, okay, so if you do get into trouble, you have debt, you have, things that are keeping you from, you have wage government taking 65% of your wages. The ways out of that debt are just not there. The off-ramps, the on-ramps, lots of on-ramps to lifetime debt, and the off-ramps to a lifetime debt are not there. We don't have full and robust support for our legal services community, LSC-funded organizations. This is federal funding for legal services that's free for low-income people, but there's certain things they can't do. They can't help with immigration issues. They can't help with criminal justice debt. Criminal justice debt. They can't help with like misdemeanor or infraction issues where a lot of debt actually starts and then piles up. You get your license taken away, et cetera. And most importantly, at least to me, from coming from that field recently, is legal services professionals are prevented from advocating in the space of anything without a specific invitation. It's very hard for these professionals who know exactly what these harms are and how to prevent them and how to help people actually can't even tell the government what they could do to make it better. So there's a lot of reforms that we could do there. And another thing I'd like to call out is we used to have a 10-year ban on the federal debt collection arm. It's called TOPS, the Treasury Offset Program. We used to have a 10-year ban on debt from being collected from there. After 10 years, you couldn't do it anymore. Well, that has now become a lifetime. You can have a debt on the TOPS program for your life. An exciting kind of new twist in it all is that when we gave out the federal stimulus dollars, we actually said, we're not going to intercept these dollars. Why? Because we want them to be in the economy, stimulating the economy. And California just this week passed our own stimulus, and we took that same action also for the first time. So that means that the tax credit, or through the tax system, the stimulus dollars went to more people who needed it. It bypassed that debt collection arm of the tax of the IRS and of the Franchise Tax Board. And I think we should be looking at that. If that works for this crisis, we need to recognize that people are in economic crisis all across this land. And it should be the standard policy that if somebody's low income and they're seeking a tax credit because of that income and they're eligible for it otherwise, we shouldn't be collecting money back to ourselves. We're undermining our investments. And so those are a couple of other things I'd like to highlight.
I just wanted to add, and piggybacking on Jess's very, very powerful story about her own family, that one dimension of a federal job guarantee is that it would provide an assurance of employment for folks who are from segments of our national community that are frequently excluded from jobs altogether. So I'm thinking about returning veterans, young returning veterans in our military who have a tremendous amount of difficulty finding employment. I'm thinking also of individuals who are subjected to discrimination in labor markets, particularly Black and Latinx workers. But I'm also thinking about persons who have had to serve time in the criminal justice system, folks who have been incarcerated. Once they've served their time, they have a tremendous amount of difficulty finding employment. And so if we had a federal job guarantee, they would be assured of at least that option upon their release from imprisonment.
We have reserved time for questions that the audience can contribute and that we can answer. But Daisy, do you have any closing thoughts before we get to those questions of what are the types of policies or directions to move in to increase economic security amongst the workers that you work with?
Yeah, I was just thinking I wanted to just add a little bit about, I think, a huge barrier, right, for many of the workers in garment, but definitely not all. There's an estimated 20% of the workforce is undocumented. And I know there's, national conversations that are starting around offering a pathway to citizenship for essential and frontline workers. And so I really wanted to lift that up as an opportunity, right? Again, these workers have been facing outbreaks at their workplaces. These are 100% sweatshops, right? And they're crammed factories without windows, without ventilation. And workers were in these conditions producing the masks that we wear every day to keep us safe, right? And so I think making sure that garment workers are included in that conversation and really thinking about it, I think, is an opportunity. And in California, the garment workforce is the largest in the country, but there are other smaller industries throughout the country. I mean, New York for sure. So I wanted to lift that up as well.
Thank you all so much. And this wraps up this portion, and now we can interact more with the people who have tuned in.